Hello and welcome to Beyond the Curve, a brand new video series from Sennheiser all about audiophile. I'm your host, Eric, and today we're going to unpack a pretty popular topic and answer questions from you all around the audiophile community. And that topic is tuning. Without further ado, let's run the intro. Today we're talking tuning, and I'm joined by two very special guests filming right from the German headquarters. I'm here with Werner and Jermo. Could you guys introduce yourselves?
Sure, Eric, thank you. I'll just start out. I'm Jermo. I'm the product manager for audiophile headphones. I'm with the company since 2014 as an integrated degree student, and I'm here mainly for two reasons. And that is first, I'm also in the audiophile community. I've been since 2013. And then until 2017, when I really joined the development team in a sense, I was really just like you guys. And I really only saw what the company put out. And I only saw basically back then Axel Grell. And I was a huge fan of him. And I thought, oh, well, he did the HG800 and HG600 and he's a superstar. And actually, I did an internship with him and we got along really well. And so I joined his department permanently. And from then on, I through some happenstance, now I'm sitting here and now I'm doing the product strategy for that category. And I just want to give you some sense of how it is from the inside. So basically giving you a chance of seeing, okay, this is how it would be if one of us would lead the company. It's just basically some random thing that happened, and I think it could be very interesting for you. And the second thing is that back in the day, I only saw basically Axel as the face of Sennheiser, especially audiophile, and I really want to change that. We all want to change it, and we really want to show all the stars in the development team. And Werner here with me is one of those stars, which I'm really, really grateful to work with. So give it up for Werner.
Okay, thanks, Jermo. Hi, Eric, and hi, everyone who's watching. My name is Werner Pfeffer. I'm an acoustic and signal processing engineer, and I joined Sennheiser about 5 years ago. Before that, I worked as a freelance sound engineer and used many Sennheiser products. And yeah, because I love those products, this is why I applied here at Sennheiser, and fortunately, I got the job. And over the last years, I was working on the Momentum True Wireless 2 and 3. Mainly, I was taking care of the sound tuning, all audio-related stuff, noise cancelling functions, and really making sure that our highest audio quality is not compromised in any way when you, for example, turn on the ANC. Yes, and I was also involved in some wired audiophile headphone development.
Thank you both for lending your expertise. I gotta ask, where the heck are you? Because it looks like the coolest little cave where you can get lost in the intricacies of audio. Where are you? Tell us a little bit about the setting here.
Yeah, this is a transducer lab. So this is, or technicum, as we say here at Sennheiser, and this is basically where our colleagues from the transducer development really build the transducer from the ground up. So they simulate here, they build physical prototypes, they test them with laser measurement machines like the one behind us. And it's basically where the magic happens. So this is, I think, what sets Sennheiser really apart from a lot of other companies, that other companies just take off-the-shelf transducers, or they use, I don't know, it's a fairly straightforward process for them, but for us it's really science that takes 5 or even 10 years for a transducer to reach maturity. And that is what we are really proud of. So I'm really happy to sit here at the heart of what makes this company special. And it's also in the cellar, so this is why it's a little bit dark here. And that is super important because all these measurements are taken here and they are really sensitive to any vibrations occurring. So if you are up in the building, for instance, and just a truck is going by, then the entire building vibrates and then your measurement would be sort of done. And so it makes a lot of sense to do it in the cellar. And yeah, that's why we're here, and I'm really happy to be here.
I don't think the setting could be more perfect, because today we're going to talk about tuning. And tuning is one of those, it's one of those terms that is involved in pretty much every audiophile conversation, whether it's on some of the forums or YouTube comments and Reddit. Everyone talks about tuning. I think there's a vague sense of what tuning is, but I want to build up a little bit of knowledge for those watching and give you the definition from the source of what tuning is. And so let's talk a little bit about the word tuning and how you approach it inside the laboratory.
I mean, that's a very broad question, but I would just generally say that to that generally, and that is actually really cool that we are sitting here in the transducer lab, that all of our transducers are made to sound really good out of the box. So ideally, we don't have to do any or much tuning. We can just stick a transducer into a headphone chassis or into an earphone shell, and it will actually sound really, really good already. So this is another luxury. So that tuning is basically the third step, or let's say the fine tuning only, because 90% of it has already been done by our transducer colleagues. But generally, it would be really trying to find a really good and natural balance of all frequencies, so that you can ideally hear them all as you would like to, and that you have really fun listening to the music. Or I think there are basically two goals to it. So for me, Werner is sort of the neutral goal, the representation of that, because he worked as a professional. And for me, it would be more enjoying music. And those are two different goals. One is really hearing it exactly as it should be, like the artist intended, and the other one is that your head gets wobbling and that you are in the tech and that you just really forget what you're doing. And the cool thing is, it's not always the same opinions we hold, but the goals intersect much more often than you would expect. So if you have a very neutral monitor, they are also really fun to listen to. But Werner, maybe you also have an opinion on it.
Well, Jermo, I totally agree with what you said. So I would say very important for tuning is just to make sure, like the technical aspect, that all frequencies are there, nothing is missing, that you have low distortion and a very balanced sound. But then there is a second component. You can have a small deviation from, or even a big deviation from a neutral tuning target, which makes listening very much enjoyable in different situations. And yes, to find a compromise between those two is what we do every day.
Tuning is similar to how a wine enthusiast describes the flavor and the taste of a wine, or how a car enthusiast describes the handling. There's a lot of fluffy terms out there on the internet, but that's what we have to use to try to dig into the tuning and translate it and tell someone else about it, essentially. How do you describe how you are experiencing something to someone else? And we're going to get more into that later, because not everyone hears the same. Everyone hears a little bit different. But there's goals, and there are targets, as you mentioned, when you craft a headphone. And that's another topic we're going to explore in Beyond the Curve. I want to jump right into a question that we received from Instagram, actually, and I'm going to read it verbatim here. Is there a specific Sennheiser goal in mind when creating an HD XXX? So I'm paraphrasing here, but whatever model you're working on next. And they go on to say, I generally associate a pure, clean studio sound to Sennheiser's house sound. But what do you guys think? Are you tuning to a specific target for that headphone? Do you have a general principle in which you're trying to stick to?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and we know that it's asked all over the time on the internet what Sennheiser was thinking maybe with the last release, or what we'll do next. But really what is at the core of the company is really a lot of engineering and scientific knowledge. So we try not to work by analogy, so just thinking about, okay, this is one way and we'll just do it a similar way, but we really try to go down to the scientific basics, where we can really say, okay, this is how it's really perfectly neutral in a way. And actually, I have a headphone here, which is really cool and has a special place, I think, in most hearts, and which did it the first really, really well. So it's in this fancy box. We don't build it anymore, but it's the first Orpheus. And I just hold it up a little bit. I hope most viewers are really aware of this model, but it was released in 1991. and it is really known, or it was known for a long time, that it was the best headphone in the world, and it has now been superseded by the HE1, the successor, a few years ago. But it's still, people that have heard it are still always amazed and mesmerized by it. And what we did with that headphone for the first time was to do what we call diffuse field loudness equalization. And it's a very technical term, so I have to explain it very briefly. And that is, you take an open headphone like that one. So the ear cups are open here, and you put it on your head, and you sit in a specific room with a bunch of loudspeakers around you, and they all just play a white noise, for instance. And you do it for multiple frequencies, for thirds, and then you always try to match the sound of this diffuse sound field around you with the sound you hear through the headphones. And that is the scientific way to really achieve neutrality in a headphone. So that you can always really, in the end, if it's done ideally, and if you have a very high quality sound source, that you cannot differentiate the headphone and the loudspeakers anymore. And that is something that the Orpheus does super well, for instance. So that was the first headphone of this kind, and that is the way it should be done in our opinion. And it has been replicated, for instance, in the HE600 series for dynamic headphones, which are still the gold standard for neutral tuning. And now comes the hard part, that this is a very open headphone. And for this sort of headphone, this method works, but you cannot do it with a closed headphone anymore, because then you don't hear the loudspeakers anymore. And the same with an in-ear, that it also isolates, and you have to maybe always reseat it, so you always disturb sort of the original sound that you had. And this may sound a little bit like a trivial problem, but actually that is a huge one. So here we can really say this is matter-of-factly as neutral as it can get, but for every other acoustic system, we actually have to do some sort of interpretation, and we cannot go anymore with the security of scientific knowledge, if you will. But that would be basically the one example of the ideal state in which we would like to be. And now some of you will probably say, oh, well, Jermo, that doesn't sound quite right. Not every Sennheiser headphone is perfectly neutral, and not every open one, and most famously the recent HE660S2. And the reason for that is that we have a bunch of neutral headphones, and we try to cater to a large audience. And some people, like studio professionals, like people that just enjoy very neutral sound, they are super well served with that sort of sound. But there's also sometimes preference for a little bit more bass, a little bit more fun. And that is just an individual preference. You cannot change anything of that. And so if we want to cater to a large audience, then it makes sense for some products to deviate a little bit to one side or the other.
That's terrific insight, and it ties back into that question, because they asked, do we have a house sound? And I think we do, and it's based on some of the tuning principles which form the core or the launch pad for an open headphone. Those that listen to this 600 series find that there are similarities between them, but when you start comparing them, that's when you get the differences, and that makes sense now. Hearing that, there's the diffuse field equalization is a great way to lock in the Sennheiser sound, and then from there, you can tune objectively toward your goal.
Sorry to interrupt you, but there's actually, you said diffuse field equalization, and that is not exactly what I meant. So it's really diffuse field loudness equalization. So you can diffuse field equalize just with a measurement head. You can put a measurement head in the middle of the room, and it will also show you some sort of curve. But the important part is it's always a human hearing it. It's always a psychological part of it. Oh. So it is very important that a physical human really adjusts the slider on loudness, and that he really sees, or that he really can put in what the psychological effect of the sound is. So for instance, if you have the same sound pressure level arriving at your eardrum from a headphone or a loudspeaker, then the loudspeaker will sound louder, because your brain thinks, oh, well, it's farther away. And that is something you cannot capture with a measurement head. So it's really important to never leave out the human element, and you can measure as much as you want, but the ultimate test for any headphone is always the ear.
Wow. I did not know that. That's quite interesting. There's a human touch. Regardless of how scientific you want to get, there has to be someone that ultimately says, yes, this is how it should sound.
Yeah.
So the transducer is tuned and measured, and there's both science and art in tuning that. Is the transducer, which is part of an overall system, is that doing the majority of the work? How much does the transducer matter with respect to things like the acoustic chamber and materials and back volumes and all of those things?
Well, the transducer matters a lot. So without the transducer being right, being perfect, anything you add won't make the whole better. So, for example, to achieve low harmonic distortion, the transducer has to be right. To have a very deep bass extension, to have a perfect high frequency playback, it's all in the transducer. It has to be in the transducer, and it has to be right. It has to be very carefully developed.
So in the end, some people basically also kind of put sound differences always on the transducer. So for instance, if you have two very similar headphone models and they sound differently, then there's always a wondering, is it now the same transducer or a different one? And the reality is you can shape the sound a lot also with the earpads, for instance, and with the volumes you have and dampenings and all that stuff around it. But as Werner said, the transducer itself is really the ultimate bottleneck, if you will. So if you do not have that high frequency extension in the transducer, you cannot bring it back somehow. If you do not have low harmonic distortion in the transducer, you cannot bring it back somehow. If you have already a thruft somewhere and a big breakup mode in the transducer, you cannot erase it just with some piece of damping. So it is basically really it is probably the foundation of everything else. I think that is a good way to say it.
And so those principles, that tact is very different for an open headphone versus a closed headphone. We talked about an open headphone using diffuse field. What does that process look like for something that's sealed off and essentially closed?
Yeah. Honestly, then you're sort of relegated to that thinking by analogy and also by just preference, so that you have a target group. Ideally, you do it also statistically, and you get a larger sample of preference. But overall, you have to try. And of course, the logical starting point would be to use this diffuse field loudness equalization. But you quickly realize that good frequency response measurement of a closed headphone or even an in-ear does not look the exact same way as it would with an open headphone. And the example I like to use the most is the bass response. So the more open the system is, and this counts the most for loudspeakers, is that the more there's a perception of bass. So for instance, if you have a loudspeaker, then you can have a lot of fun just listening to a flat bass response, or maybe like a 2 dB boost or something. So and then it already sounds perfect. If you have an open headphone, then you can maybe work with a few more dBs of boost, and it will sound natural. And then you close it off and you go to a closed headphone, and suddenly you need like 7 dB or something of boosted bass to make it sound right. And then you go to an in-ear, and that is of course the most closed system. You have the smallest transducer, the least interaction with your body, and then suddenly you can arrive at something like 11, 12, or even 15 dB. And some people will say, yeah, this sounds perfectly right for me. So it is really a lot of try and error, and it is very hard to foresee really what sounds good. So in the beginning, we tried to set a goal frequency response or something, but then we listen to it, and oftentimes we find, okay, this is not perfect, and we have to change afterwards. So you cannot just do the goal first and just execute and then you're done. You have to really just experiment and listen and experiment and listen, and then you arrive at something that you think that people will love.
Now, Sennheiser has some pretty sophisticated simulation, modeling, and testing equipment and processes. We're going to talk about that in a future BTC. I wanted to ask though, how do you accommodate for ears? I mean, everyone's ears are different, right? And if we're trying to tune to a target, what do we do to try to find the happy medium when everyone's ears could be slightly different from each other?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. That's a very good point. When headphones are compared or discussed, often people only look at the measurement of the earphone in a reference coupler. But in reality, the frequency response is measured in real people's ears. can be significantly different, and you have to really think about it when developing earphones. So if you have open headphones, just like the HD800 or HD600 series, the difference between different people is very small, but the tinier the earphones get, for example, if you have an i900, for example, an in-ear phone, then the differences between different people get a bit larger. And for example, in the IE900, it has 3 resonance chambers, which are there to fine-tune the high frequencies and take care of some resonances and just cancel them out, dampen the resonances. And yeah, we take a lot of time just to make sure that the headphone sounds excellent in smaller ears and in larger ears. So that's definitely a huge part of our work.
Thank you. There's an assumption, I think, that one size fits all, and clearly that's not the case. Depending on the type of earphone or headphone and its application and your desired tuning, there could be several ways to approach the tuning of it. We have a question from the YouTube.
I would actually interject for a second, sorry. There's actually Werner also worked on the Sennheiser Momentum to Wireless 3, which I personally also really like. And it may look a little bit like a safe tuning, if you will, if you just look at it on a reference coupler. But that is exactly the background, again, that it should sound fantastic across a huge variance of ears. And for instance, if you have a different sized ear canals, then the mids can just vary in terms of loudness by something like 4 or 5 dB, which is completely changes the balance of the earphone. And the great thing about the Sennheiser Momentum 2 Wireless 3, without doing a sales pitch right now, is that it sounds pretty good across just a lot of different people. And that is something what is sometimes forgotten when looking at these just reference coupler measurements.
It is interesting to go through the comments in the forums and hear opinions align, because sometimes you don't know what you're going to get. You're listening vicariously through someone else's ears, but whenever you see someone describe the tuning as we intended, it always feels pretty good. We do have a question from the YouTube community I wanted to ask, and this user asks, some of us are DIY or do-it-yourself headphone enthusiasts. It's very difficult to find information on how to tune a headphone. For example, I've never seen an engineer work on an open back headphone. On the other hand, it's very easy to find piles of information on tuning and constructing and designing loudspeakers, including generous and free simulation software. Essentially, we talked a little bit about diffuse field in that process, but can you share some insight on your approach to tuning and constructing a headphone, an open headphone, and what are some skills that someone should sharpen in order to become more familiar and comfortable with that process?
Yeah, I encourage everyone just trying to DIY headphones. I never thought about that, but it's true. There are loads of tutorials on loudspeakers, but I never came across about DIY headphone tutorials. Yeah, maybe once. But yes, try to find an excellent transducer. And what do you need? You need a headband, a cushion, and I think that's it. This is something that's enough to start with, I would say. I don't know if people like to hear some tuning tips. I mean, they probably have heard that, but mainly the amount of bass, for example, is determined by the air leak of the front volume. So if they want a lot of bass, they can try to make the cushion airtight. Maybe use some leather on it that that the air leak is very small. If they want a very open headphone, they could use a very open foam or whatever. But yeah, I would say it's just 2 transducers, some 3D printed ear caps, headband, and good to go. Some soldering skills, but that's it probably to start.
Yeah, I would also say for starting, and that's also what I did in my basement basically a few years ago, was just take existing headphone chassis and took different transducers, which I could luckily just take from the firm, which most of you don't have the luck to do, but and then just exchange the transducers. So that's a fairly luxurious thing that we have a bunch of transducer platforms, and they can actually be interchangeably be implemented in headphones. So this is, for instance, an HE560S chassis, but it has I don't know if you can see it. We can also show it in more detail. It's a Sys40 actually from an HE660S inside. So this is a luxury that we have here, and sometimes just experimenting, replacing components and seeing what changes. And then as Werner mentioned, for instance, that you can also, if it's too many high frequencies, you can put toilet paper or something in front of it, and that will dampen the high frequencies. Or if it's too little or too muddy a bass, and you can also look at the damping of the magnet hole and then try to find a certain sort of damping material and cut a hole inside. And there's a really bunch of things you just have to try out. And I think a funny part is that actually you can also simulate headphones to a certain accuracy. So it's for everyone of you who has like electrical engineering background, which is highly recommended if you want to get into loudspeakers or headphones, you can actually also create like an electrical circuit just for acoustic components, and then you get a readout of what the frequency response would be. And that is actually fairly accurate if you are good at finding, let's say, a good approximation of what an acoustical element would look like in an electrical signal, which is obviously not easy, but it's also, I don't think, out there. So I don't think we'll put it out there tomorrow. I'm sorry.
Another question from YouTube, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here. Sennheiser is now producing lively drivers with sound suitable for all genres. What is the next stop on the tonal path or the journey of Sennheiser's tuning?
Yeah, so if I understand it right, it's whether we have a goal to go away from what we do right now, or I think on the whole not too much. So I think the core that we have is already pretty good. I think we built some of the most neutral headphones in the market. I think it's really an incredible how to say it's. I think basically no other company can say that for themselves, that they have built basically the reference for good sound. So to that respect, I don't think we need to change that much. But what is correct is that some of these older headphones do not have a really punchy bass. That is correct. And I think in that regard, we see some room for improvement, certainly. And honestly, I also think that in terms of transducer technology, we are not really at the edge of something. So the problem with new technology is that you often don't, that you cannot really say you want it unless you've experienced it. And so a lot of people, I think, have just resignated and said, okay, it won't get any better than an HE600. But I'm a very optimistic person, and I think we can get much better, actually. And that is also one of the most motivating factors here.
The way music is mixed is also very different from even 5 years ago, never mind 15 or 20 years ago. So our tastes as people evolve, and the way we experience the amount of detail we can and input we can receive and enjoy has certainly evolved. If you were to take music from today and play it back on a transducer from 50 or 60 years ago, you would have a very different experience than if you took music from that age and brought it into a modern transducer. Let's use that, though, to segue into this question. This is from the headphone community. Again, I'm paraphrasing here, but the question was, do you think the Harman curve helps or hurts a user's or a customer's expectations?
That's let's say it's a multifaceted question. I do believe that to a certain degree it is a little bit overrated. I think the research is incredibly good. It's really valuable, and it sort of shows statistically what we've found out 30 years ago to be scientifically correct, and that is that the HE600 with some extra bass would be sort of ideal for a lot of people's preference, or for 70% or so. So that is really nice confirmation for us. The issue that I see is that some people, and I do not really want to say that in a negative way, because that is simply for lack of choice. So I think everybody would like to just try out every headphone and then would make their judgment. But of course, if you're just getting into the hobby, if you're just not near a hi-fi shop or something, then obviously you don't have the choice of trying a lot of headphones, and then you have to work some other way out. And these measurements are the most objective way you can get at it. And the problem is that sometimes it gets then reduced to just the measurement. And that is where I'm a little bit, where I'm not a big fan of, because in the end, what makes the audiophile hobby, in my opinion, interesting is everything beyond the frequency response measurement. So the old Orpheus is not great because it has a certain curve, a certain shape or something. It is great because it has a very, very large transducer, which is extremely light. It has a very fast transient response. It is very well designed so that it has no break or very controlled breakup modes. It just sounds super organic, and it's just super fun to listen to. But these are all things that you will not see in the frequency response. So if you want a great frequency response, you can get it for a cheap 50 euro or even 20 euro in ear. And if that is really your end goal, then that is the end of it. But I think that is honestly where great sound starts. And then you look for, okay, I want more detail in the music. I want more space in the music. I want greater bass impact. These are all the things that you cannot read in the frequency response. And yet, paradoxically, that is sort of left out of the discussion then. So those are my thoughts on it. So I think the research is super, super valuable, but it leaves out actually what I, as an enthusiast, would care about.
Yeah, maybe to add here, I also think the research of Jean-Olive and his colleagues is very valuable. I would interpret the Harman curve, how to say? I would say what it shows that there might be something then that excellent tuning, and that the tuning preference between different persons is not that big, or that maybe with a high shelf and a low shelf filter, or just a bit more bass, bit less bass, bit more highs, bit less highs, that those are tools to produce headphones which almost everybody likes. I would say the downside of the Harman curve discussion is that, to my feeling, people often are just looking at graphs and not listening. Yeah, just a story. When I tuned the Momentum Trivalis 3, once I came up with a tuning I really liked, and I tuned the Momentum Trivalis 3 not only sitting at my office, but also in the plane, on the train, in a car, on the go. Just I tuned the headphone in the same situations where people would actually use it, and with ANC on, with ANC off, and so on. When I came up with a tuning I really liked, and also my colleagues liked, we just checked back. We just tuned then the headphone in the same way the Harman curve predicted that we should like it better, or the average of the people should like it better. But that was definitely not the case. So our expert listening panel definitely preferred the tuning we came up with, and yeah, it's not the gold standard, I would say.
So we have another question from YouTube, and this one is there a science behind the tuning of the IE series, namely the 600 and 900? They say scooping out the 2 to 5K region feels like the sound is dry. So I think we have a question that has a personal preference tied to it, but can you talk a little bit about the tuning of the IE series and what the goal was, especially with respect to the resonator chambers?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I have the i900 here. I'll just fetch it very quickly. And it's actually a very special unit to me, because Werner here actually had some in-ear samples that he perfectly matched, and he gave me one of them. So it's my personal pair. I'm very proud of it. And I would say that this is basically the best interpretation of the historical Sennheiser tuning, if you will, for in-ears. And I know there is some discussion about it, and that is where I think it is most, let's say, it is most obvious that just tuning by analogy does not necessarily work. So just taking like a target that was developed for over-ear headphones and saying, okay, we'll use it now for in-ears and it will work magically well, I think where that hits the limits at some point. And also to recognize that on the one hand, neutrality can be your goal. And on the other hand, sometimes by tastefully reducing or increasing some frequencies, you can still create other effects in your music listening experience that you would probably like to have. And one of them is certainly space. So in a high-end headphone, in the HD800, we are really well known for having probably the best spatial reproduction of any headphone. And the i900 to us was sort of an HD800 to go. And the problem is, of course, that you cannot put the 56mm transducers inside your ear canal. That is a bit of a challenge, and users would resist that process. So we thought about, okay, how can we actually bring the feeling of that spatial sound reproduction into an in-ear phone? And that is sort of what this reduction at 3 kilohertz really can provide. So that is one point of it. And the other one is also just listening loudness. So what is also really important to recognize that our hearing is not like a flat microphone, but it actually is very, very insensitive to very low tones and also to very, very high tones. And that effect increases, especially in the highs as you get older. And the louder you listen, the more neutral your hearing gets in a way. But that's not really recommended over a long time. So it would be really better if you listened at 60 or 70 dB if you want to be safe. And actually then it makes sense to have a bit more of a V-shaped sound, as you would say, so that you have slightly elevated bass and slightly elevated highs to still make the music listening experience very enjoyable and that you are not missing out anything. So these are some of the things to consider, and also for just variation that like the individual resonance that you get from your pinner, that is very different across people. And especially if you just try to compensate it in an in-ear, we see that if you express it too much, then it easily gets too much. So way too much. So it becomes shouty, as you would say. And what we try is to really build products that many people as possible like, and not to hit an arbitrary target, but try to not overshoot where we can. And I think the i900 does it really well. And I think it's really, really important as a finishing statement to that question is also to recognize that the internet opinion that you have on Reddit, on YouTube, on Discord, that is, I think, a very, very sworn-in community, if you will. And for instance, a lot of people like on the internet there in these channels like the i600 much better than the i900. And here comes a reality check. The i900 actually sells better than the i600. and so the question is, how much does the sentiment in these channels represent really the entire market? And that's an open question, honestly. So we make the i600 for those that would like that tuning, and we think the i900 is really the pinnacle of the traditional Sennheiser tuning. And to me, it is really the highest end sounding in-ear. So I can really sometimes just forget what I'm doing and just zone out with the music. And that the i900 does better than any other in-ear for me.
Wow, that is incredible. Thank you for your insight. And thank you for bringing us a lot closer to the development process. Werner and Jermo, we appreciate your time here going beyond the curve. And thank you to our community for submitting these questions. We hope you found them useful. If you're watching this on YouTube, just remember this will be published as a podcast as well, so you can take it to go and listen wherever you happen to be. Please stay tuned for another episode of Beyond the Curve. We're going to unpack even more topics. We're going to get into modeling, simulation, the transducers themselves, testing, and all sorts of other fun audiophile goodies. So thanks for joining us. I'm Eric. It's been a pleasure. We'll see you in the next one. Thank you.